one of them. Okay, cool. That was my fault. I apologize for that. All right, if everything sounds okay, we can get started here. Okay, so I have a Unreal Engine level here, and the first thing I'd like to talk about is collision complexity. So let's go ahead and get started. Collision complexity is a property on static meshes. Every static mesh in an Unreal Engine level has collision geometry. And depending on the asset, it has complex geometry, and it may or may not have simple geometry. And to get some geometry into our level, we can import it or we can create it here in Unreal Engine. And if we create it here in Unreal Engine, say
Alexa,
in
volume 7.
modeling mode, let's see, MN8, could you go ahead and mute yourself?
Yes,
And
sorry.
anyone who comes in, we'll go ahead and make sure they're muted. Okay, thank you. So if I want to make a mesh or create one in modeling mode, I can do so here. I'm going to create one. I'm going to select cone and just click in my level and get a cone. And we can adjust the cone settings. We can give it a shorter height, for example. We'll give it 100. And we can create it. Now, if I move my face here, we can choose the asset location. If we choose current folder, then wherever we are in our level, in our content folder, let's say we have a meshes folder with a cone folder inside of it. If I go to that folder and choose current folder and I accept, then we'll create a new mesh and it goes straight to that folder. And, I can rename it SM cone. And like all meshes in the level, this has geometry. And as most of you probably are aware, you can open up the static mesh editor and you can see its geometry. You can go to show and you can show simple collision. Now, this mesh does not have simple collision because I just created it here in modeling mode. So when I show simple collision, it's showing me the triangles in the triangle mesh. And we often refer to this as the complex collision of a mesh, right? But every mesh, every static mesh asset has a collision complexity. And when you create a static mesh in modeling mode, the collision complexity defaults to use complex collision as simple. And it's important to understand what that means, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But really, our meshes we create in modeling mode do not automatically get a simple collision. And you can add a simple collision here in the static mesh editor, such as, let's say, a box simplified collision, and now my mesh has simple collision. And because my collision complexity uses complex collision as simple, it's going to use that triangle mesh for collisions. Now, what does that mean for collisions? Unreal Engine has two different systems that perform two different types of calculations when it comes to collision. We have queries, or the query system, and we have the physics system. And use complex collision as simple means we're always going to use that complex mesh. In the case of this cone, it's not very complicated. It's 64 triangles, and that's not a very high poly mesh, relatively speaking. But use complex collision as simple says we're going to use that. And what do we use that for? Well, if we're using physics, if this particular mesh is simulating physics, and because I created a static mesh actor here in the world, it has a static mesh component automatically set to this cone. And if I go and look at its collision presets, they're set to default, which means that we're using the default static mesh collision presets that are here in the static mesh editor. And by default, it gave me block all, which is a set of collision settings built into the engine with these properties set. And block all basically says use both the query and the physics system and block everything. So while this particular mesh may or may not be simulating physics, if we go and check it, we'll see that it's not. Use complex collision as simple says use that triangle mesh, don't use any simple collision for everything. And if I bring in, let's say, something that is simulating physics and drop it on here, like a sphere, my sphere, by the way, does have simple collision. It has a sphere collision hull. And if I simulate physics on this and I check to see that it is blocking its collision presets as default, which means it's using the static mesh collision presets. And if I look at that, we see that it's using, well, it's custom, but we could set it to block all, block everything. And if I go ahead and drop it on the cone, it's going to bounce off of that complex collision. So use complex collision as simple means use that complex collision even if there's a simple collision. And as you probably would guess, this is more complex, more computationally expensive, and requires more calculations to detect collisions using all of the triangles in that complex mesh. Whereas with a simple collision hull, such as a box like this, that's going to require less calculations and it's going to be more performant. Now, use complex collision as simple does not just mean that physics is going to use this, but also queries will use this as well. For instance, if I have an actor in the world that performs a line trace, and that's exactly what this actor is, if I browse to it or just edit it and open it, it's a simple actor with a sphere static mesh. And on begin play, all it's going to do is perform a line trace. And it's tracing using the visibility channel. It's tracing starting at its own location, going out by 200 units. And by default, a line trace like this seeks out the simple collision. It sinks out a simple collision for whatever is in the world that's in the way of the line trace by default. And if I go ahead and just press play, well, it would help if I aimed my line trace in the correct direction. If I press play with the line trace going out in that direction, it hits our cone and it hits the complex collision. So that's another thing that use complex collision as simple is going to do for our collision complexity. Even though this line trace is tracing for simple collision by default, it still hits the complex collision because it's treating that as if it were simple. And line traces, at least line trace by channel, the blueprint expose function, has the parameter trace complex, which you can set to true and intentionally trace for complex collision. But here we see that we're not using that. We're just tracing. And that by default traces for simple collision. So how do we use the simple collision? We change collision complexity to one of the other settings. And we have three other settings: use simple collision as complex, simple and complex, and project default. Now, if I choose use simple collision as complex, well, this is kind of going the other way. It's using the simple collision. So anything that by default uses simple collision will successfully use simple collision. As we can see, this ball, which is simulating physics, has now fallen onto the simple collision. It's no longer bouncing off of the complex, and I can use the show collision console command and see that box simplified collision there, holding it up. And I see that my line trace has also hit that simple collision as well. Now, the box simplified collision blocking our physics simulating ball with gravity enabled makes sense, right? Physics should use simple collisions by default because that's the most performant. And really the only way to get around that is to force it to use the complex collision with use complex as simple. But now that we're using simple as complex, even if we try to use the complex collision, we will still use the simple. If I go to my line trace, for example, and I trace complex, now I set this Boolean to true, Now this line trace is seeking out the complex collision for whatever it hits. And if I press play, we'll see that, well, it's not hitting the triangle mesh, it's hitting that box simplified collision because we're forcing it to treat that simple as though it were complex. So it doesn't matter that we have a simple and a complex. If we're using simple as complex, we'll just ignore that complex geometry altogether when it comes to collisions. Now, these are two
Steven,
different. Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but you have quite an echo still going. So it's been suggested it could be that your OBS is capturing your Discord mic and repeating it, but it's quite an echo.
Okay, that's not good. Thanks for letting me know about that. Let's see. If I can probably turn this
I
down.
have muted the live stream.
Yeah, I
it's
think
fine.
in case of that presentation, you can mute your stream. I think we don't need the
Yeah.
sounds from the. Depends if you need the sounds for the.
Okay, so if I turn off the mic, how about now? Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. It's much quieter, but it doesn't have the echo.
Okay, so I basically what I did was I turned off my mic for the stream like you guys suggested. And I'll go ahead and up my gain on my mic there a little bit. How is this better?
Say something.
Check, check, check.
It's still pretty quiet.
Okay, how's this? Is that better?
That's not really different.
Okay, hold on. Let's see if I can get this right. Well, an alternative here is I can simply stop recording. Okay, how is this? Is this better?
Yeah, it does still have a bit of an echo, though.
Okay, is it severe? Is it hard to hear what I'm saying?
No, it should be fine.
Is that better for us to mute this live stream in Discord and just hear it from the channel? Normally, I was doing it. It was fine.
Okay, so when I muted my my audio in the stream itself, it sounded okay?
Or us to do that. I have
Oh, or
muted
if you
here
do
on
that,
Discord.
okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and it has no echo.
So if you mute me in Discord, then you should be okay.
Yeah, the live.
Okay. Okay. And okay, so I still have OBS recording my audio here. So if you mute me in Discord, you can hear me. And if I leave my settings as is here, that sounds okay?
Yeah, for me it's okay.
Okay. So we'll do that, I think. We'll see how that goes. Okay. Cool. And do please feel free to interrupt me if anything doesn't sound or look okay.
Steven,
Yeah.
you can also right click on the stream in Discord and mute the stream audio because your mic audio is a lot clearer and crisper than the stream audio is. So you can either mute you or mute the stream. And
Okay.
I've found if I mute the stream, your audio quality is a lot better coming from your mic.
Okay, so so right here, if I just turned off my mic for my Discord mic, and now it should be coming through just OBS virtual camera. So how does that sound?
It's very quiet.
Yeah, that's your stream audio.
Oh, okay, so mute that. Okay. The other way around.
Right.
Okay. So
Yeah.
how is this better?
Much.
Much better. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. And it looks like we're still, yeah, okay. I'm recording desktop audio in OBS. All right. Sorry about that. Cool. I think we're good now. Okay. So sorry for derailing there. So I believe we were talking about shape complexity, simple and complex. And so I have my cone now set to use simple as complex. And we saw that performing a line trace will hit the simple and not the complex. And so is collision. I think we drove that point home. So these two are using two different types of calculations, two different systems. We have the query system and the physics system. These are both two different trees, data structures. Trees meaning trees in a spatial partitioning sense, and we'll talk about that if we have time later. But the two different systems are being calculated separately, and which ones a particular asset is participating in, well, that depends on its collision settings. Its collision profile will determine that, particularly its collision enabled setting. And we'll talk about that soon. Right now, I have my cone set to query and physics, which is why it's participating in both of these systems. Queries being the line trace as an example of a query, and physics being a object simulating physics that is generating a blocking interaction with this particular cone. But as we can see, it's using simple collision and not the complex. And if we were to change it to simple and complex, well, now we can use both depending on the situation. When a mesh is using simple and complex, it's capable of using its simple geometry. In this case, we have a box here, and the physics system is going to default to using that. And complex being, well, let's say we have a line trace and we have the ability to trace simple or complex. If we're choosing trace complex, we're going to be able to trace against the complex collision, as we can see here. So the physics simulating ball, simulating gravity, is going to hit that simple collision, and our line trace query is going to hit the complex collision. And that's the and complex part. We're using both here, and we can opt in or out of using simple with that trace complex option. And a lot of these queries have the option to trace against the complex collision. And that's really if you need more precision for your line trace, you have to, you don't want to register a hit even if it's missing by a little bit, or in this case, a noticeable amount. You can use complex. But it's rare. It's more rare in serious games because you're going to be using up more resources to detect a more precise collision like that.
So I have a question. If I
Sure.
want to use both simple and complex, let's say I want to use complex for ray tracing, but for physics, I only want to use the simple or the other way around. Is that possible to do using the settings in the blueprint that you were showing?
You can use simple for physics and complex for ray traces like I'm doing here. If you want to, you would use simple and complex in that case. But if you want to use the complex geometry for physics, you have to use complex as simple. And this is very limiting in the sense that if you use complex as simple, you're forcing all systems to use the complex geometry. And
Right. I
and,
get you.
and right. And one of the limitations of that is, let's say I do that for this cone. If I take the cone and I change it to use complex collision as simple, Now we have more restrictions on this mesh. For instance, if I try to simulate physics on the mesh, simulate physics, check, and press play, it's enabled gravity, but it's failing to fall. And if I hit stop, we get a warning that says trying to simulate physics on this particular static mesh component, but it has complex as simple. So they're incompatible. And this might be a point of confusion. You might be thinking, well, how come a physics simulating ball can bounce off of it if it's not simulating physics? Well, simulating physics is for updating the physics of this particular mesh. For instance, being able to knock it around and update its position with the physics system. If we uncheck simulate physics, well, it's static. It can't move via physics anyway. We can set its location manually with set actor location or update component locations with functions and logic, but we cannot let the physics system move it around either by gravity or by bumping into it with forces and so on, because we're using complex as simple. So that's one of the restrictions of use complex as simple. So you couldn't say use complex geometry for physics and then use the simple for queries, but you can go the other way around and use simple for physics, which is more common, and then your line traces have the option to choose trace complex or trace simple.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, of course. So that's what use complex as simple does, and what use simple as complex does. If we use simple as complex, we're using the simple collision for everything. Physics, queries, even if we try to trace complex, we'll still hit the simple. But if we're using simple collision now, well, we don't have the restriction of not being able to simulate physics anymore. So we can simulate physics, we can let gravity do its thing on the object, and it can fall, it can be knocked around, and so on. Now, that's the bottom two settings: use simple as complex and use complex as simple. We've seen that simple and complex gives you the option to use both. Physics will use the simple, queries can use either one, and then there's project default, and that's just going to default to a setting in your project settings. If we go to project settings, we can search for the default setting for this, which is called default shape complexity. And as we can see in at least 5.4.2, it's set to simple and complex by default. So any static mesh that has its collision complexity set to project default, it will default to whatever the default shape complexity is here. And if you want to err on the side of performance, you could change this to simple as complex if you wanted to. And then you'll never use the complex collision. Simple and complex is the most common because it's more versatile, and you have the option to choose complex in your queries if you want to. But just because it's set to simple and complex in project settings does not mean that you can't just overwrite it here. Whatever you have here is overriding the project default.
Stephen,
Yeah.
can you use levels of detail with complex collision meshes? Like say an object is further away and you don't want it to be using the full complex, but you want to use a custom or a one of the simple meshes for collision. Can you do that with LODs, or is it just a yes or no thing?
Yeah, you can't really, not without probably making some changes to the engine to customize that. LODs are more of a visual
Okay,
thing.
so it doesn't work with the physics engine. It's basically just for visuals.
Yeah, you're gonna have one set of collision hulls, and yeah, you'll have to implement a custom solution to do changing collision hulls, or changing your collision dynamically. All right, so that is collision complexity, and your static meshes are going to have your collision complexity setting set at that static mesh in the static mesh editor there. And our actors, all actors in the world, um, Well, they're actors, right? And each actor has a root component, which may or may not have collision. Collision actually stems from the primitive component class. So by default, a new actor with a root component has a scene component as its root. Scene components don't have collision. Once we get into primitive components, we start to see the collision settings, static meshes, skeletal meshes, shape components. Those are derived from primitive component and have collision settings. Now, default shape complexity determines whether we're using simple or complex collision. But when it comes to determining what kind of interaction we'll get and the sort of results that we'll see, one point of confusion that I often see a lot is that you may take a look at two objects' collision profiles and determine what you think is going to happen when they meet in the world. And when that particular reaction, that particular result is not what happens, this particular point of confusion may be why you're confused about that. So I have two objects here, and they're both set to block each other's collision. If I open these actors and I look at their mesh, first of all, if I look at their collision settings, their collision presets say default. And because this is a static mesh component, default means use the static mesh component's collision settings. So this ball mesh being used is a SM Sphere 30. That's the name of the static mesh asset. And if I open the static mesh in the static mesh editor, I can look at its collision settings. We're using one of the built-in presets, block all, which has these settings. And so my actor's ball mesh is using default, so it's going to default to these settings. Now, this is something that you can easily things can start getting out of hand when you start changing things. For instance, I can override the collision settings here in the actor, at the actor level. I can change this to one of the other presets. I can change it to custom and start messing with the presets individually. And now my actor ball mesh has different collision settings than the static mesh asset itself being used. So now that's different. And then even further, if I go into the world on an instance of the actor and select the ball mesh, I can even go in here and change this to a completely different collision profile, or change it to custom here and start messing with the collision settings here. And now this particular instance of the actor has different collision settings than the class, which has different collision settings than the static mesh asset itself. So it can be hard to track bugs down when there are a lot of inconsistencies like that. So if you want a particular static mesh component on an actor to use the same settings as the static mesh asset itself, you can set the collision presets to default, and you'll default to that. But just be aware that you can still override on individual instances. So these two actors have a ball mesh using the SM Sphere 30. And on each individual instance, just to make sure that we know what's going on, I can select the ball mesh in the details panel. I can see collision presets is set to default for both of them. And if I go to that static mesh actor, or the static mesh asset itself, I see that it's block all. So they're using collision-enabled query and physics, object types, world static, and collision responses block to everything. And we'll talk about what this means soon. But what this means in general, in a nutshell, is that this static mesh asset, which does have simple collision, if I show it simple collision, it's using a sphere simple collision, one of the simplest forms, and it's configured to participate in both queries and the physics system. Its object type is world static, a collision channel assigned to it, just so that objects can differentiate between each other from a collision standpoint. We have object channels to differentiate them. These are collision channels. And then we have a set of responses to all the collision channels. Block all blocks everything. So these two objects are configured to block each other. However, the way that we move objects matters when it comes to determining what the result will be. And I'm gonna actually move my face to the left here, just so you can see the settings on the left, on the right. The way we move the objects in the world matters when it comes to determining the outcome. How are we moving these objects? Well, what we have here is a call to add actor world offset in tick. And this is based on a parent class BP ball. That's why we have a call to the parent. We can see that BP ball is very simple. All it does is it delays for a short delay, 1.5 seconds, before calling start moving. Start moving sets a Boolean should move to true. That's all it's doing here. So what we're doing in tick is we're checking if should move. If that's true, we'll start calling add actor world offset. And all we're doing is getting the forward vector. We're multiplying it by a certain amount. That amount is a speed multiplied by delta time, or get world delta seconds. So just so the movement is frame rate independent here. And we're calling add actor world offset. And the result of this is that we will move the actor forward by this amount per second. And we are doing so passing in a Boolean value for sweeping called should sweep. And we'll talk about what this means very soon. But if we look at our actors, we can see that exposed variable. It's instance editable. It's called should sweep. And it's set to false on this actor. And it's set to false on this actor. So the way these actors are moving, as you can see, they're pointed towards each other, is they're moving towards each other a little bit each frame. Add actor world offset is going to literally set the location of the actor. And every single frame, it's going to basically move them towards each other, right? Well, if they're set to block each other's collision object channels, and they're both set to query and physics, then we expect them to block each other, right? And if we press play, we wait 2 seconds or a second and a half, and they pass through each other. So this may seem confusing. Why do they pass through each other if they're set to block each other's collision channels? If they're both set to query and physics, their collision profiles are called block all. So what's going on? Well, the reason that the way we move the objects matter is because we're using a function to set the location of an actor directly. And if that means that one of its components or one or more of its components is going to overlap or intersect with another component on another actor, so be it. We're setting the location directly. But if we set this parameter should sweep to true, then we're now moving with sweeping, and sweeping is going to check where the object is now, where we're trying to move it, and whether or not there is a blocking collision on the way, and it will move the actor up to but not past or through the blocking collision. So if we select this actor, and did we have a question? Okay, if I select this actor and I find its should sweep Boolean and set it to true, and I take this actor and set its should sweep Boolean to true, we're now calling add actor world offset with should sweep true, so the sweep parameter is true, and if we press play and let them move into each other, they block each other. So sweeping is required for two objects to block each other physically when we're setting their location directly. And that's via functions like add actor world offset and other functions that are similar, such as set actor location. Here we have a function, or a pair of actors rather, that have a slightly different blueprint. They wait until should move becomes true, and then they call set actor location. The other ones we're using add actor world offset. This is set actor location, and we're doing the something similar we're setting a new location vector and we're setting the actor's location there. And basically it's taking the previous frame's value for that and adding the forward vector multiplied by some speed times get world delta seconds. So this small amount every frame, we're adding that to the location. We're essentially moving it towards its forward vector little by little every single frame, and we're setting the location directly. So without sweeping, if should sweep is false on both of these, and we press play and we let them move, they'll pass straight through each other. And these have the same collision settings. We can verify that by going to the ball mesh on each one. They're set to default. That means they're going to default to the static mesh settings. They're using the same static mesh as the actors over there. So they're block all. And we can go ahead and set should sweep to true for both of these. Press play, and we'll see that they now block each other. And sweeping doesn't have to work in tiny increments like this. These are using tick, but we can simply call add actor world offset or set actor location once and set an object's location. This one basically has a slightly different blueprint. As soon as should move is true, we call start moving once, and all it does is add an actor world offset equal to the forward vector scaled by a teleport distance, which is 200, and we have the Boolean sweep. So all we're doing is calling add actor world offset once, should sweep is set to false, and we have a blocking collision in the way, and our object simply passes through it. It teleports from one side to the other, no problem. But if we enable sweeping, set that to true, press play, it stops just short of the blocking geometry. So sweeping is something that prevents the object from passing through. Now, it's worth noting that we mentioned there's two different types of calculations. We have the query system and the physics system. Setting the object's location like this and using sweeping is using the query system. Interestingly, no physics is involved at all for this type of blocking collision. So it seems like, they're physically blocking each other, and indeed they are, but doing so via sweeping like this doesn't even require collision. In fact, we can go to the static mesh asset being used, that we're using its collision settings, and we can change them so that we're no longer even using physics at all. I can take my collision presets and set them to custom, and take my collision enabled and set it to query only. And if I set this to query only, we're no longer using the physics system. We're only using the query system. And if I go ahead and press play, they should have their sweep Boolean set to true. They block each other. So even though every frame we're no longer simulating physics, we're now setting the object's location directly, only using the query system, we still get a block. Now, because I set the static mesh asset to query only, we get a bunch of warnings because there are other objects, other actors in the world that are attempting to do things like add forces and things that require physics. So coming in here and setting this to query only breaks other things. So if I set this back to block all, that fixes that. But we can override individual components on individual instances. For instance, I could take this object, take the ball mesh, and override its collision settings here. I can set them to custom, set collision enabled to query only. I can come over here, select the ball mesh, set it to custom, and set collision enabled to query only. Now both of these are using only the query system, no physics. I can press play, and they block each other. I stop, no warnings, we're good. And the same goes for these two as well. I could take this particular actor, take the ball mesh, set it to custom, set collision enabled to query only, press play, and I expect it to be blocked. Oops, there it is, by the wall. So it's not going to teleport to the other side. So movement, setting the location directly, not using sweeping. We pass through things even if they're configured to block each other's object types unless we use sweeping. And this is using the query system. Now, if we stop using the query system, then we will stop getting a blocking collision even if we're attempting to sweep. So selecting this object, taking its mesh, setting its collision enabled to no collision, well, now this object doesn't even have collision enabled at all. They're going to pass through each other. So it can get a little confusing. If they're both using query only and they're both sweeping, they'll block each other. But if only one of them is sweeping and the other is not, then the one that sweeps will get that sweep block and the other one will not. For instance, I can take this actor to the right. I can set should sweep to false. The one to the left has should sweep set to true. And if we let them move towards each other, well, you'll notice that the one on the left, object A, it stops when it detects a blocking collision, but object B is not sweeping. It's going to happily continue on its way because there is no sweeping in its add actor world offset function call, preventing it from doing so, from blocking. So that's collisions using that type of movement, which is completely different from using the physics system, which we'll talk about next. But before we do, does anyone have any questions on sweeping and moving actors in this manner? Okay. I think we drove that point home. On the other side of the room, I have a different set of actors. They look the same, but they're moving in a different way. They're using forces, and forces are going to use the physics system. So we have a different class here called BP ball add force. If I browse to it or edit that blueprint, all this does is on begin play, takes the ball mesh. Oh, it has a on component hit event to draw a debug sphere on it. Where's my call to add force? Oh, it should be in should move or start moving. Yeah. As soon as the parent class calls start moving, it's going to call simply add force. And all we're doing is getting the actor forward vector. We're multiplying it by a force magnitude and calling add force on it. And these actors, their ball mesh, is set to default collision presets for both. And as we know, it's block all, so query and physics. World static, I believe, for its object type. Doesn't matter because it's set to block all collision channels. But we can just show it world static. And we'll talk more about, if there's time, what those different collision channels might mean or should mean, or what your project can determine them to mean. So all we're doing is adding a force, and that should happen after a couple seconds. And as we can see, not only do the objects block each other, but they bounce off of each other. So they stop short of overlapping, but they also get pushed in the other direction because physics is it's a different system, and it's updating the location of these components using a set of calculations that are completely independent of the query system that we witnessed over there. And when two objects bump into each other, they impart forces, they push each other away. And this whole process uses the query system and is, as I said, independent of the query system. I think I just said the physics system. They use the physics system independent of the query system, and we can prove that by taking each of these and setting their collision presets to custom and changing collision enabled to physics only, no query collision. If we do that, we should still expect to see the same result. So custom for both, collision-enabled physics only, press play. They still bounce off of each other. So if you know the type of collision interaction that you want an actor to have, if you want it to be bumping into another object as a result of physics, interactions, and forces, and you know that you don't need one or the other, query or physics, this is one opportunity for some optimization, for some performance gains, because often we get by default all of everything. When I created a new object, my cone, for example, my static mesh, um, by default, we're given these settings, and they're not necessarily the most optimal. If I take a look, I mean, for one, we had the collision complexity. Use complex as simple is the most expensive option. So when you create something in modeling mode, you get the most expensive collision complexity because there is no simple collision. So that's something to be aware of. And then we get block all, which is collision enabled query and physics. And if you don't need queries, or you just need queries and don't need physics, you can start to make some optimizations at this point. This particular actor here doesn't need queries. So there's no point to have query and physics. We can have physics only. And over here, same with these objects, we can have query only. But if you need both, that's totally fine. Use both. But if you don't need both, that's when you can start optimizing. So we see that add force uses a different system than set actor location or add actor world offset. And we see the physics and the query systems at work here. But this isn't these aren't the only two types of movement, right? When we're when we're controlling a character that's using a character movement component, we're moving via the movement component. We're not calling add force or set actor location on our character, at least for normal movement. We're going through a movement component. So this brings us to another method of movement via movement components. And movement components are a more sophisticated way to move an actor or a component. A movement component has a variable called an updated component, and movement components are capable, at least the built-in movement components in Unreal Engine, the ones that we have by default, are capable of checking their updated component and seeing what's going on with them. Are they simulating physics? Do they even have collision, and so on? So one example of one of these built-in movement components is a projectile movement component. We use these quite a lot for projectiles because they're easy to add to an actor. You just add it to an actor, and it automatically just launches the actor according to some parameters. And the question is, well, what kind of movement is this, and what kind of collision interactions will we get with a static mesh component or any component with collision in general that's being moved by one of these? And the answer is that the projectile movement component is going to check its updated component and see if it's simulating physics or not. So if I check out my BP ball projectile movement is what this class is called. This is perhaps even simpler than the others we've seen. It doesn't have any logic in the event graph for actually moving it. It just has a projectile movement component. And here we can configure things like initial speed and so on. And what we can observe first is when our updated component is simulating physics. Our projectile movement component under the hood checks the updated component, sees if it's simulating physics. If it is, then only the initial launch parameters for the projectile movement component will affect the actor. And then that updated component is handed off to the to the physics system to have its position updated and collisions detected. So here we have our ball mesh on BP ball projectile movement. and it's set to simulate physics. And it's always a good idea to check the instances in your world when it comes to any property that can be overridden. So I'm going to take my ball mesh on this actor and check and see if it's simulating physics, and it is. We're not using gravity. Same thing for this one. Check the ball mesh, simulating physics, not enabling gravity, and it's moving via movement component. Let's see what happens. If we press play, they bounce off of each other, and we get those resulting physics forces because the projectile movement component launches it and then lets physics handle it. But I mentioned projectile movement components are more sophisticated. They're capable of looking at their updated component and seeing if it's simulating physics or not. So what happens if they're not? Well, let's turn off physics for both of these. I could take this one, uncheck simulate physics. I can take this one, uncheck simulate physics, press play, and they stop. And notice it looks a lot like what we saw over on the other side of the room. We saw two objects stop and they don't bounce off of each other, unlike with physics, because now we're using the query system and not the physics system to detect those collisions. The difference is that the projectile movement component is continuously updating the location of the updated component, and it's doing so using sweeping. But that's a parameter. The projectile movement component has the ability to turn sweeping off if that's the kind of movement you want. You can open that projectile movement component and find should sweep. Where is it? Sweep collision is called. We can uncheck that on the projectile movement component, and we now have projectile movement, and they just passed right through each other. Even though they're configured to block each other's collision object types, we're moving without sweeping now. They're not simulating physics, which means projectile movement component updates their location every frame, and we unchecked this sweep collision option, so now they're just going to move without sweeping. And
I have
every
a
time,
question.
oh yeah, go ahead.
When you do that and you have your two objects, when they hit, do they generate an overlap event or just a hit event?
Good question. If we get a blocking collision interaction, those hit callbacks will be generated, and we'll talk about those in a minute. If we have an overlap interaction, then overlap callbacks will be generated. And the way that you determine whether or not you get a hit callback is whether you get that hit collision interaction. Now, if we're setting locations directly and we're not sweeping, as you can see, two objects will pass right through each other, right? What happens if they have an on-component hit callback um, assigned, like bound to that particular asset? Well, we could figure that out by adding a on-component hit to the ball mesh on begin play by simply, well, we could bind it this way on component hit. We can assign it on begin play like that, or you can use on component hit and get, that's not the right, on component. Oh, sorry, I have to select a ball mesh on component hit, and we can get the event that's automatically generated for the ball mesh. So anyway, let's say we have a print string and we print the hit component or the other actor's name or something like that. These two are, let's turn off sweeping for them. Well, first we'll leave sweeping on and let them bump into each other to prove that there we have those hit events. Now, the thing about hit events is they'll spam as long as there's movement and collision blocking interactions happening. I disabled sweeping for this one. I turned it back on. Now they'll block each other and we get the blocking interactions, right? Now, if we take sweeping and turn it off for this one, take sweeping, turn it off for this one, press play. No collision, no hit callbacks whatsoever. And that's because we're moving them, we're setting their actor location directly, we're not sweeping, and we don't get a blocking collision interaction when we're moving them this way without sweeping. That makes
But
sense.
you would still get the overlap
Um,
because they overlap at some point.
they need to overlap each other's collision object types to get an overlap interaction. And
Oh, I see.
yeah, and they have to be configured for overlaps. They have to have query and at least be able to participate in the query system. And then
So if
there
they're
needs to
set to
be
overlap instead of block or ignore, then they would generate the overlap events, right?
correct. And
Okay.
whenever two objects have differing collision responses to each other's collision object types, we always take the least blocking collision interaction. And when I say interaction, I mean ignore, overlap, or block. So two objects blocking each other's types will have a blocking interaction. If at least one of them is not blocking, we won't get a block. We'll get the least blocking of the two, whether it's overlap or ignore. Which is why if anything has ignore set to another object's type, you'll always get ignore, no matter what the other object's response to that one would be. So yeah, that's what we get when we have a projectile movement component moving objects using sweeping. We can disable sweeping and they will not block each other. And then if we are using a projectile movement component and we are using sweeping, projectile movement components are kind of cool because they have the option to sort of fake physics, and we can see that at work by checking should bounce. It has a boolean called should bounce, and if we let them bounce off, let them hit each other, even though they're no longer simulating physics, well, let me make sure of that. Yeah, no physics here, no physics here. They bounce off of each other. I don't know if you saw that, but there we go. They bounce off each other, and they go. Wait, let me just. This one is called object A. This one is called object A. I'm going to change it to object B to make it easier to see. And we'll press play here. So we have B on the right, and B bounces back and goes back the way it came. So, and this is without physics. So this is using sweeping, using the query system, because neither of these objects are simulating physics, and we have sweep collision on the projectile movement. And this has nothing to do with the sweep parameter that these BP balls have. That was just an exposed Boolean that I was passing into the functions we were using on the other side of the room. We're not using those here. We're using the projectile movement component. Okay, so, and this is all showing different outcomes using different methods of movement for objects that are all configured to block each other's collision object types. And that's kind of the most simple case to analyze, is that, you know, two objects have the same collision profiles and they're set to block each other. And that's the case for all of these. And we saw different outcomes just because we were moving them in different ways and using different systems, query versus physics. So the way the way that objects move matters. And if you're wondering about the character movement component, the character movement component moves the character's updated component, moves its updated component, which is the character's root component, which is always the capsule. And the capsule is query and physics, but it's moving via sweeping and setting the location. The character movement component uses sweeps and queries to detect all sorts of things. It's very sophisticated, but it also is capable of, you know, bouncing off objects that are simulating physics as well. So the character movement component itself is a more complex topic that could really have its own complete talk. But let's talk a little bit more about, let's see how long it's been. We'll talk a little bit about the collision settings. Looks like we're going on a little over an hour. So we'll talk a little bit about the collision settings, and then we'll open it up to some questions. But Basically, our sphere here, well, I can open the cone, it doesn't matter. We'll open up a static mesh, anything with a collision profile. And we saw that the only things that we were changing was the collision enabled on these objects. And I'd like to talk a little bit more in detail about what these settings mean and what you can expect from them. So first of all, collision presets is a dropdown, right? And we always, whether we're in an actor or on an instance with a component selected, when we're looking at a collision profile or an object's collision settings, we have this collision presets dropdown with a number of options. And when we select one of them, we have our collision settings filled in and they're grayed out. We can't change them. And that's because we have a set of collision presets with a name and the settings. These are what we have given to us built in, and we can see those in project settings. If we go to engine, collision, and under preset, those presets are here. Now, the fact that they're grayed out is actually more of a strength than a weakness, and that's because if you have the correct collision profile for a particular type of object in your game, you want all objects in your game of that category to have the same collision settings. Can we get someone? Someone might have their mic on. Could you mute yourself, please? Thank you. And if you have all of the assets in your world, if you select those components and you go in and look at their collision presets and they're set to custom, no one component with custom is necessarily the same as another component with custom. Custom is a wild card. It's the only option that lets you go in and change the settings individually. So I can have this component here have its static mesh collision presets set to custom, and I can have this one over here have its collision presets set to custom, and they can have drastically different collision settings. And if there's bugs or behavior that doesn't behave as expected, it's really hard to go into each individual component and find which collision setting is incorrect, because it could be any one of them or it could be all of them. But if you zero in on the correct collision settings on a specific collision preset, then you can just assign that to a large number of assets. And then if you found that one setting on that profile is incorrect, if you fix it, you've fixed all the assets that are using that collision setting, that collision preset. And you can make as many collision presets as you want. All you have to do is come in here and select new. And let's say you'd need a collision preset that is supposed to overlap with the pawn and ignore everything else. Well, you can create an overlap only pawn. And let's say this is designed for trigger boxes, which may use a box or a sphere component, something like that. You can then know that you're not going to need physics for that, so you can set it to query only. If those objects are not going to be moving in the world, you can set them to world static, because maybe that's what your project designates world static to mean. These object types, it's up to your project to determine what these are supposed to be used for. And, you can give them also a description, overlaps only with the player, ignores everything else. And you can set the response to all collision channels to ignore except for the pawn, which is overlap. And if you create that, looks like overlap only pawn already exists. So for demonstration purposes, I'll call this overlap pawn only. And now that I have overlap pawn only, I can create a collision volume actor called BP trigger. Give it a collision shape. Let's give it a box component. box collision, and I can come in here and set the box collision. And by default, we get overlap all dynamic, but we're going to set it to overlap. I called it overlap only pawn or overlap pawn only. There it is, the new one. And it ignores everything but the pawn. And this is much more performant and better practice than just using an overlap all dynamic. What overlap all dynamic does is, yes, it's query only, so that's good. And it gives it the object type world dynamic, which may be what you want. And it has an overlap response to everything, which means that anything else that is participating in the query system, so at least query only, that has a collision object type that is at least overlap or block with world dynamic, it will register an overlap collision interaction. Now, whether there's a collision callback bound to one of the interacting components or not doesn't matter. There's still a collision interaction being detected. And this is perhaps one of the more evasive performance issues, because if you don't have collision callbacks like on component begin overlap, on actor begin overlap, and so on, bound to one of these components being overlapped, you'll never know that those collision interactions are being detected behind the scenes. And just because there's nothing bound to one of these overlap delegates doesn't mean that they're not participating in query calculations. So just because a preset exists in the engine built in, ready for you, does not mean it's a good idea to use it. I can't really think of very many examples where you would need to overlap against all collision object types. And in a more complicated, serious game project, you're going to have custom collision object channels and trace channels that just having a preset that blocks every single channel in your game is something that could potentially lead to performance issues. So you can use overlap all dynamic when you're prototyping and getting things working, but for a more serious project where you have collision boxes like this, you may want to think about creating your own custom preset and changing it from overlap all dynamic to something that only overlaps exactly what you need it to. If it's just the player controlled character, you can set it to pawn, or you might have a custom object channel for the player so you can differentiate between players and enemies and so on. And you can create your own collision object channels here. You can create a new object channel and choose a default response for all other collision profiles to just default have a response to this too. And you can have, as soon as you do that, then a good idea would be to go through all of these and make sure that they all have the correct response. They might not all want to block it, overlap it, ignore it, and so on. So you can have as many collision presets in a project as you want. You can, in fact, make different presets that have the same collision settings, but are determined to be assigned to different types of objects in the level. That's fine. You can basically do whatever you want with these. You can even go into the built-in ones and edit them and make sure that they have the responses to your custom channels set correctly. You can fix the overlap all dynamic. If you create a new object channel and its default response is block, then you'll go into overlap all dynamic, and you'll see that it has a block response to that new channel. You can then set it to overlap so it's correct and it's still overlapping all, and so on. Now, you can only create 18 custom channels, and that's shared between object and trace channels. So that's something to be aware of. If you get up to 18, you might want to rethink things, because adding a new collision channel greatly increases the complexity of your project from a collision standpoint, because every other object in the world has a collision profile that needs to have a response to all channels. So the more channels, the more complex, the more types of interactions you need to configure. So it's good to be sparing with object and trace channels, but don't be scared to use them if you need them. what's the difference between object channels and trace channels? Well, our components that have collisions, such as, well, any primitive component, such as a box component, static mesh component, we can assign an object channel as its object type in its collision profile here. So if I go to object type, notice I can give it one of the object types. We can't give it a trace channel as its object type. So that's why this isn't called collision channel, it's called object type. It is a collision channel, but there are two kinds of collision channels, object and trace. And traces are not for objects. They're for performing queries, line traces, and so on. If I go back and take a look at my actor that has a query, my line trace actor, notice that it says trace channel here. We can choose a trace channel, and when I perform this line trace, only objects that are set to block the trace channel are going to register a blocking hit with this trace, and we can't select, at least with line trace by channel, we can't select object collision channels for this. You can't, there are ways to do it in C++, but not with this blueprint expose function. It only allows you to use a trace channel. But if your line trace, if it doesn't make sense to use the visibility channel, let's say you need a channel that you have custom responses to with different components in your level, well, you can come in here and create a new trace channel. Let's say it's for your weapon. We can call it weapon. Default response set to block means now all of these are going to have a block response to the weapon channel. So you'll have to change that in various collision profiles. But now if I go back to line trace by channel, I can choose weapon here. And now I'm shooting a line trace that has the weapon channel. And if I come into my level, by default, this cone is going to have a blocking trace to the weapon channel. I can check it right here. We have block. And let me just make sure I'm not covering that with my face. Yeah, I'm on the other side. We have a block response. So if I press play, we do get a hit. It's simulating physics. That's why it fell. So we did get a blocking hit. I'm going to disable gravity real quick just so it's not distracting. But I can take this particular cone, I'll set its collision presets to custom, and come to its collision responses to the weapon channel, and I can ignore the weapon channel. And now if I press play, we don't get a blocking hit at all because this line trace is tracing using the weapon trace channel, and this object is ignoring the weapon trace channel. So that gives us more fine-tuned control. And something like a weapon is a pretty common case for creating a custom trace channel. You might also create ones for IK and things like that. So yeah, so that's I think we've covered most of the stuff. I have some other things on my list, but I think we're getting a little bit past our time here. So I think this would be a good opportunity to take some questions. So if anyone has any questions on what we covered so far or anything collision related, feel free to ask, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. One thing that I was expecting to hear a question on is CCD, continuous collision detection. So I think I'll go ahead and touch on that real quick before we wrap up. A lot of people in, let's say, like the multiplayer shooter course or who are working on shooting games who fail to get collision interactions with their projectiles or with their weapons tend to enable CCD on their projectiles because they don't want to miss, their collision interactions. So it's going to depend on how you're moving your projectiles, but if you're using physics on your projectiles, and your projectiles are phasing through objects, phasing through walls, and failing to get hits, you can enable CCD on them to prevent that. And to explain how that works, we can come back over here to our actor here on the wall. We're using set actor location with this, right? And if I disable sweeping on this actor, we'll see that we can set its location from right here to right here, just one function call to set actor location. We're setting it right here on the other side of the wall. It's going to teleport to the other side of the wall. And we see that if we enable sweeping and we press play, it does not reach the other side of the wall. It stops short because it detects the collision from point A to B. Now, when we have a fast-moving object simulating physics, the physics system is updating its location at each frame according to physics calculations. And if this object is moving so fast that on one frame it's on one side of a wall, and on the other, on the next frame, the physics calculation determines that its location should be over here on the other side of the wall, well, that's just because its velocity is so high that updating it from one frame to the next means that it's now on the other side of the wall. So even though the objects may be configured to block each other's object types, we'll get phasing through like that. That's simply a result of having too high a velocity, and we can't detect that collision. Enabling CCD is essentially the same thing as sweeping with this example here. We enabled should sweep. Now we can't pass through because every time we update the location, in this case with a single function call, there's a collision detection performed with a sweep made with the updating of the location. So let's see that in action. Let's take one of these objects that are simulating physics here. We can just use this one that's using add force. I can bring it over to this side, and I can put it in front of a wall. I'll go ahead and just put it right here. And we'll see what it looks like here. We're using add force. We can press play. And we see that it bounces off the wall. But if we add a big enough force, we should be able to see it pass through that wall. And let's move these over to here. And let's just take that force that's being used on this force magnitude. I can check Excel change, and that will make sure that the force doesn't, it basically means we won't take the mass into account of the object. So I can use a smaller number and get a bigger force. I can give this a really big number. And if I press play, it goes straight through. In fact, it might have phased through that wall over there. So I want it to phase through this wall and not that one. So what I'm going to do is cut that down so it's not quite so high. Let's see if we can zero in on a good force. We'll go down by a couple of zeros again. There we go. Well, it still phased through the other one. It was still going pretty fast. Anyways, you get the point. It's going so fast that it passes through. It doesn't bounce off. So what we can do in that case, if our objects are simulating physics and moving tremendously fast, is I could take my ball mesh and I can find use CCD. It's under advanced in one of the, I might have to search. Here it is. Under collision, advanced, use CCD. I can check that checkbox, press play, and boom, it doesn't phase through the wall. So here's without CCD, press play, phases right through. Oh, it phased only through the first wall. That's great. And then with CCD, it bounced off and we did not phase through. Now, the thing about CCD is obviously it's more expensive, and the reason it's more expensive is because every frame, the update of the location of the physics simulated component is associated with an additional calculation, and that's this sweep that has to be performed to detect if there's something in the way. and that's continuous. It's not just if there's something in the way, it's all the time. So even though we benefited from it here by getting that blocking hit, well, it's still updating every frame, even as it's flying up in the air, with that CCD calculation added on top of it. So it is more expensive, but it's there for you if you need that kind of thing. If you need that kind of collision detection, and that's what it's called, continuous collision detection. So that's CCD.
Being that that's such an expensive operation, what are some alternatives to using CCD to prevent phasing through
Mm-hmm.
like a projectile? You want to
Yeah.
just lower your velocities of your projectiles, or I mean, that may not be effective in all cases, but
Mm-hmm.
what would be some alternatives?
You can do one of two things. You can move the projectile using physics, and if it's going fast enough to need CCD, you use CCD. Or you can use the query system and move the object without physics and use sweeping. And which one you choose, it's going to depend on how you're balancing these two loads in your game project. If your game is not very physics heavy, if there's let's take the example where everything in your game is being moved by using set actor location or add actor world offset or a collision or a movement component that uses sweeping and not physics, right? If you really want physics simulation on your projectiles, let's say for whatever reason you like how the physics interactions look, you can use CCD on those because not a whole lot of your project is using the physics system in general. If it's really heavily using the query system, where most of the load is being calculated there, CCD might be okay. Now, if you have a project that's heavily using physics simulations and not using a whole lot of query, you could move those projectiles with either set actor location, add actor world offset, or use a projectile movement component and disable simulate physics on those components and just enable sweeping. That will give you the same effect. You will get a blocking hit because every frame is associated with that sweep. If those objects are moving very fast and you're getting phasing through objects, you're going to probably it's a triangle, right? There's three choices on the triangle. On one corner you have slow the projectiles down. That might not be an option for your game. On one corner you might have use physics and CCD. That might not be an option for your game. And on the third corner you have use sweeping and use the query system. And you're going to have to fall somewhere on that triangle, and you might have to make compromises one way or another. You might even have to offload some things and balance some things elsewhere in your game. And it really is going to depend on a game by game basis.
Optimization is a real bear.
Indeed, yeah, yeah, and the bigger a project gets, the more of a bear it's going to be, and the more you're going to have to start load balancing and finding how much you can allocate to any given thing. Yeah, so there are some topics I wanted to cover. I think we took up a little bit more, a little too much time to cover them. I was going to talk a little more about the queries, the types of queries and how you can customize those. I'll just really quickly mention a couple things before we wrap up. We mentioned that the line trace itself uses a trace channel, and we have different ways to perform line traces. Line trace by channel is one of the ones in Blueprint. We can also line trace for objects, which means rather than giving this trace its own trace channel, we give it an array of object types and say, hit everything that has these collision object types. This doesn't do any collision filtering. It doesn't use two objects' collision profiles to determine whether they should ignore each other or not. It will just hit everything that has that object type. And you can, of course, trace complex or not. And there's shape sweeps that have these options as well. But on the C++ side, you have a lot more ways to configure these line traces. In fact, these queries are one of the cases where there's a clear advantage to using C++ over Blueprint simply by the way of being able to customize these line traces because let's just say you want to trace against the visibility channel or a weapon channel, right? Everything in the world that's blocking the visibility channel is going to get a hit. And you can take an object in the world and have it ignore the visibility channel, then you won't get a hit. Okay, optimization performed. But what if you want to go the other way? What a lot of people don't realize about traces is they, just like objects, have their own collision profiles. They have a collision channel, that's their trace channel, but they also have a set of collision responses to the other channels. By default, if you use the Blueprint version, the responses to all those other channels is block. So this line trace here, using the weapon channel, it has the weapon channel as its collision channel, and its responses to all collision channels is block. Let's say you wanted to line trace and only hit, let's say you wanted to ignore the pawn channel. Well, you can't really do that with line trace by channel. In C++, you can alter the collision profile for a line trace just like you can customize the collision profile for a component. So if we have another talk in the near future, maybe we can get into the nuts and bolts of how to customize these queries from the C++ side. There's all kinds of really cool query functions, and they're not all exposed to the Blueprint side, and they're not all of their functionality is exposed. So we'll talk about that more in a later date. But yeah, I think that's enough to wrap up today's talk. If anyone else has any other comments, questions, or anything else, we'll give a few moments for that. Otherwise, thank you for joining me, and we'll put this up on YouTube as well. This is all covered in the book. There's a lot more covered in the book that we didn't have time to touch on, but those customizing of the collision settings for queries and traces is all shown how to do in C++ in the book. And we go over more detail about setting up those collision profiles, setting up custom trace channels, object channels, why you might want to create those, how to optimize the game so that you're erring on the side of ignoring as much as possible. So there's a lot of opportunities to get some better performance out of your systems by just kind of understanding what's going on. So yeah, if there's no other questions, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. And thank you all for joining me today.
Thanks for your time, Stephen.
Absolutely. And thank you for
You do great
the
work.
questions. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Stephen.
I have one question.
Sure.
Where can we buy that book?
Yes. So you can get the book. It's available on Amazon as paperback and hardcover. And it's also available as an ebook on Kindle and an audiobook on Audible. And the audiobook should be available in all regions except for two. I think it's Australia and Japan. I'm hoping that's going to change because it's unfortunate that it isn't available there. If it's not available in your region, it should be by now, but check back over time. Hopefully it'll be available there.
All right, thank you for answering my question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably I will buy that book.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. No worries.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time and have a great rest of your day. We'll see you soon.
See ya.
Bye.
Later, Stephen. Thank you.